Fear is a weapon. Until you meet someone who doesn't understand, they're supposed to be afraid. Eunseok Shik had built his reputation over 15 years of running organized crime in Chicago through the strategic application of fear, making examples of people who disrespected him, ensuring everyone understood that crossing the Shik family resulted in consequences that were swift, brutal, and permanent. People who worked for him feared disappointing him. Rivals feared challenging him. Civilians feared accidentally attracting his attention. That fear was the foundation of his power, the reason a 38-year-old crime boss controlled operations across 3 states despite aggressive competition from established organizations. Which made what happened at Riverside Elementary School on a cold Tuesday afternoon in November so completely unprecedented and world-shattering. Eunseok received a phone call from his 7-year-old son Min-jun's school at 2:47 p.m. He'd been in a meeting with his lieutenants discussing territory disputes with a rival organization when his phone rang with the school's number displayed. He answered immediately. Calls from Min-jun's school always took priority over business because his son was the only thing in Eunseok's life that mattered more than maintaining power and control. "Mr. Shik, this is Principal Davidson from Riverside Elementary. I'm calling about an incident involving Min-jun." "What kind of incident? Is he hurt?" "No, he's not hurt. But there was a disciplinary situation in his classroom that requires your immediate attention. His teacher Ms. Foster has placed him in detention and is requesting a parent conference today if possible." Eunseok felt cold fury rising. "What did this teacher do to my son?" "Ms. Foster disciplined Min-jun for disruptive behavior during class. She's following standard school policy. But Min-jun is quite upset and I think it would be beneficial if you could come in to discuss. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Eunseok ended the call, told his lieutenants to handle the meeting without him, and drove to Riverside Elementary with the kind of focused rage that usually preceded someone dying. No one disciplined his son. No one made Min-jun upset. And certainly no teacher had the authority to punish a child whose father could destroy their entire life with a single phone call. Eunseok had carefully chosen Riverside Elementary because it was a private school that catered to wealthy families, where substantial donations ensured that Min-jun would be treated with the special consideration appropriate for a child whose father was influential. The school administrators understood that keeping Eunseok Shik happy was worth bending rules and overlooking disciplinary issues. Apparently this Ms. Foster hadn't gotten that message. Eunseok would correct that oversight immediately. He arrived at the school, bypassed the security desk with the kind of confident stride that made security guards instinctively not challenge him, and walked directly to the classroom number Principal Davidson had provided during the phone call. Room 237. Second floor. Ms. Ava Foster's third-grade classroom. Eunseok didn't knock. He opened the door hard enough to make it bang against the wall, walking in with the full force of his intimidating presence that usually made people immediately submissive and apologetic. The classroom was mostly empty. Students had been dismissed for the day except for 2 children sitting at desks doing what appeared to be detention work. One was Min-jun, who looked up with visible relief when his father entered. The other was a girl Eunseok didn't recognize, also working on detention assignments. At the front of the classroom, standing beside her desk with a stack of papers, was Ms. Ava Foster. She was black, maybe early 30s, wearing professional attire that suggested she took her position seriously. She looked up when Eunseok burst through the door, showed absolutely no fear or intimidation despite his aggressive entrance, and said in a calm, firm voice, "Mr. Shik, I presume. I'm Miss Foster. I'm glad you could come in for our conference about Min-jun's behavior. Please have a seat so we can discuss this properly." Eunseok stared at her. She'd just watched him burst into her classroom radiating obvious fury, and her response was to politely ask him to sit down like they were having a scheduled parent-teacher conference. "You disciplined my son," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that usually made people stumble over themselves to apologize. "I did. Min-jun was disruptive during our math lesson. He was talking over me while I was teaching, distracting other students, and when I asked him to stop, he told me I couldn't tell him what to do because his father was important and I was just a teacher. That behavior required disciplinary response. My son is 7 years old. Whatever he did doesn't warrant punishment." Your son is 7 years old and learning that actions have consequences. That's part of education. He disrupted class, he was disrespectful when corrected, and he's now serving appropriate detention while we discuss how to prevent similar behavior in the future. You don't discipline my son. You don't punish him. You teach him what you're paid to teach and you show him the respect his family deserves. Ms. Foster looked at him with an expression that suggested she was evaluating whether he was serious or performing for some reason. Mr. Shik, I teach all my students with respect. That includes teaching them that disruptive behavior has consequences regardless of their family background. Min-jun doesn't get special treatment just because you're wealthy or influential. You have no idea who I am or what influence I have. I know exactly who you are. Principal Davidson briefed me when Min-jun enrolled. You're Eunseok Shik, you run organized crime operations in Chicago, and you've made substantial donations to this school that you expect will result in your son being treated differently than other students. I'm telling you that in my classroom, that's not how things work. Eunseok felt genuine shock. She knew who he was. She understood his position and his power. And she was calmly explaining that none of that mattered in her classroom. You're making a very serious mistake right now. I'm doing my job. Teaching your son that actions have consequences is part of that job. If you have concerns about my disciplinary methods, you can discuss them with Principal Davidson. But Min-jun is serving his detention and will continue to be held to the same behavioral standards as every other student in my class. Do you understand what happens to people who disrespect my family? I imagine unpleasant things. But threatening a teacher for disciplining your son is inappropriate regardless of your profession. If you'd like to have a productive conversation about Min-jun's education, I'm happy to do that. If you're here to intimidate me into giving him special treatment, you're wasting both our time. Eunseok had entered this classroom planning to make this teacher regret ever touching his son. He'd anticipated fear, immediate backtracking, desperate apologies as she realized what a catastrophic error she'd made. Instead, he was facing a woman who showed no fear whatsoever, who calmly explained that his power didn't matter in her classroom, who was treating him like any other parent having a discipline conference rather than like someone who could destroy her life. It was completely unprecedented. And inexplicably, it was also the most attractive thing anyone had done in years. Dad, tell her she can't give me detention, Min-jun said from his desk. Tell her you're going to get her fired. Min-jun, your father and I are having a conversation about your behavior. Please continue your work quietly, Ms. Foster said, her tone firm but not unkind. You can't tell me what to do. I absolutely can tell you what to do while you're in my classroom. That's my job as your teacher. Please work quietly. Eunseok watched his son reluctantly return to his detention work, obeying this woman's authority despite clearly wanting to argue further. When was the last time anyone had been able to make Min-jun comply with instructions he didn't want to follow? Eunseok certainly couldn't. His son had been raised by nannies and private tutors who all understood that keeping Min-jun happy was more important than actually teaching him discipline or respect. How do you do that? Eunseok asked, genuinely curious. Do what? Make him listen. He doesn't listen to anyone. I have clear expectations and consistent consequences. Students respond to that structure even when they initially resist it. Min-jun is a bright child who's learned that he can avoid accountability through his family's influence. I'm teaching him that doesn't work in my classroom. You're not concerned about retaliation? About what might happen to you for challenging my family? Should I be concerned? Are you planning to harm a teacher for giving your son detention? I came here planning exactly that. And now? Now I'm trying to understand how you're not terrified of me. Ms. Foster smiled slightly. Mr. Shik, I grew up in Chicago's South Side. I've seen violence, poverty, and people wielding power through fear my entire life. I became a teacher because I believe education is how children escape that cycle. I'm not afraid of you because I've seen worse than you, and I'm not going to compromise my teaching principles because a parent thinks their money or influence should buy their child immunity from consequences. That's remarkably brave or remarkably foolish. Possibly both. But it's who I am. Now, can we have an actual conversation about Min-jun's education? Or would you prefer to continue threatening me in front of the students? Eunseok made a decision that would change his life completely. Min-jun, go wait in the hallway with your security detail. I need to speak with Ms. Foster privately. But Dad. Now. Please. Min-jun left, taking the other detention student with him. The classroom door closed, leaving Eunseok alone with the woman who'd just proven she was completely unafraid of him despite having every rational reason to be terrified. I apologize, Eunseok said, a phrase he hadn't used genuinely in years. I came here planning to intimidate you into giving my son special treatment. You've made it clear that won't work. I'm impressed by that integrity even though it complicates my life considerably. Apology accepted. And I appreciate you actually listening instead of just trying to threaten me into compliance. Can I ask you something honestly? Sure. Will you have dinner with me? Ms. Foster stared at him. I'm sorry, what? Dinner. Tonight if you're available. I'd like to continue this conversation in a setting that's not a classroom where I burst in planning violence. You just threatened to harm me for disciplining your son. Now you're asking me on a date? I know it's extremely inappropriate. But you're the first person I've met in years who wasn't afraid of me, who challenged my authority directly, who proved you have principles you won't compromise regardless of pressure or threats. That's incredibly attractive. So yes, I'm asking you on a date despite the terrible circumstances of our meeting. Mr. Shik, I'm your son's teacher. Dating you would be completely inappropriate. I understand. But I'm asking anyway because I'd regret not trying. The answer is no. But I appreciate that you're capable of apologizing and that you're apparently interested in something beyond just intimidating me. That suggests you're more complex than your reputation implies. That's not a complete rejection. That's not right now but possibly later. That's a no that acknowledges you're a human being capable of change rather than just a crime boss threatening teachers. I'll take it. Can I at least buy you coffee? Not as a date, just as an apology for bursting into your classroom planning violence. Coffee is acceptable. But this doesn't change anything about Min-jun's discipline. He's still serving detention and I'm still going to hold him to the same standards as my other students. I wouldn't expect anything else. That integrity is why I'm interested. They had coffee that evening at a neutral location, a cafe in downtown Chicago where Eunseok wouldn't be immediately recognized and where Ms. Foster would feel safe meeting someone who'd threatened her earlier that day. Tell me about your son, Ms. Foster said after they'd ordered. Beyond the obvious spoiling and the behavioral issues. Who is Min-jun as a person? He's brilliant. He reads at a 5th grade level despite being in 3rd grade. He's interested in science and building things. He asks questions constantly about how things work. But he's also been raised with no real discipline or boundaries because I've been so focused on keeping him safe and happy that I haven't taught him how to function in normal social situations. His mother? Died when he was 2. Car accident. Since then it's been just me raising him, along with nannies and tutors who understand that keeping Min-jun happy is more important to me than actually teaching him the skills he needs. That must be difficult. Raising a child alone while also running your operations. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. I can manage criminal enterprises across 3 states but I can't get my 7-year-old to listen when I tell him to do his homework. Because you've never established that you're actually going to follow through with consequences. Min-jun has learned that you'll threaten consequences but never actually enforce them. That teaches him that authority is performative rather than real. How do I fix that? You start enforcing consistent consequences for unacceptable behavior. You establish clear expectations and you actually follow through when he doesn't meet them. And you accept that he's going to be upset with you sometimes, that being a good parent means being willing to disappoint your child when discipline is necessary. That's harder than it sounds. Parenting is hard. But you're clearly capable of difficult things given your profession. Apply that same determination to actually teaching your son how to function in the world. They talked for 2 hours. Ms. Foster, Ava, she'd told him to call her Ava when they weren't in educational contexts. Was brilliant, passionate about teaching, deeply committed to her students' development regardless of their family backgrounds. She'd grown up in poverty on Chicago's South Side, had put herself through college and graduate school working multiple jobs, had become a teacher because she believed education was the path out of the cycle of poverty and violence she'd grown up in. "I see kids like Min-jun and I see wasted potential," she explained. "He's brilliant, but he's being raised to believe that wealth and influence mean he doesn't have to develop actual skills or character. If that continues, he'll grow up to be just another entitled adult who contributes nothing meaningful to the world. I'm trying to teach him differently. By giving him detention and refusing to be intimidated by his father. By showing him that some authorities actually mean what they say, that actions have real consequences, and that being rich doesn't exempt you from basic behavioral expectations. Those are valuable lessons. You could have just given him special treatment. The school administration would have supported that. You chose to make your life more difficult by refusing. I chose to do my job with integrity. That it makes my life more difficult is unfortunate but not a reason to compromise my principles." Eunseok had never met anyone like her. In his world, everyone was for sale. Every principle had a price. Every authority could be bought or intimidated into compliance. Ava Foster was different. Her principles weren't negotiable and her commitment to her students wasn't something that could be purchased or threatened away. It was extraordinary. And Eunseok knew with absolute certainty that he wanted her in his life permanently. Subscribe to see what happens when a teacher's refusal to be intimidated transforms a crime boss's entire approach to parenting and life, and a man who planned murder ends up planning marriage instead. Comment where you're watching from, and tell me, would you discipline a mafia boss's child knowing the potential consequences? This story is just beginning. Ava Foster's agreement to have coffee with Eunseok Shik was categorically not an agreement to date him. She'd been completely clear about that boundary. He was her student's father. He ran organized crime operations. He'd literally threatened her earlier that day. Those were all excellent reasons why romantic involvement was inappropriate and impossible. Eunseok heard all of those boundaries and proceeded to court her anyway with the same strategic determination he applied to criminal operations. He didn't ask her on dates, he positioned himself in places where they'd naturally encounter each other and then engaged her in conversations that inevitably became substantive and enjoyable despite Ava's best efforts to maintain professional distance. He showed up at the coffee shop near her apartment where she graded papers on Saturday mornings. Didn't approach her immediately, just happened to be there drinking his own coffee, reading the newspaper, occasionally making comments about articles he was reading that she could respond to or ignore. After 3 weeks of these coincidental encounters, Ava confronted him. "You're not here by accident. You figured out my weekend routine and you're deliberately positioning yourself where I'll see you." "Yes. I thought that was obvious. It's borderline stalking. It's persistent courtship of someone who's made it clear she won't agree to actual dates. I'm working within the constraints you've established. The constraint I established was no romantic involvement. You're violating that constraint. I'm having coffee in a public place where you also happen to be having coffee. If conversations develop from that proximity, that's just natural social interaction. Eunseok, this can't happen. You're my student's father. Dating you would be completely inappropriate. What if I changed that? What if I wasn't your student's father anymore? You can't stop being Min-jun's father. That's not how parenting works. I could transfer him to a different school. Remove the professional relationship that's the primary barrier to dating you. You would disrupt your son's education because you want to date his teacher? I would find him an equally good educational environment that doesn't create ethical complications for the woman I'm interested in. That's absurd. That's how seriously I'm taking this. I want to date you, Ava. I've wanted to date you since you refused to be intimidated in your classroom. I'm willing to make significant life changes to remove the barriers preventing that." Ava stared at him, processing the fact that he was serious about transferring his child to a different school just to make dating her ethically permissible. Don't transfer Min-jun. He's finally starting to adjust to having structure and boundaries. Disrupting that for romantic reasons would be bad parenting. Then what do you suggest? I continue having coincidental encounters at coffee shops while we both pretend we're not developing feelings for each other? I'm not developing feelings for you. You're lying. I can tell because you get this specific expression when you're lying. Your left eye twitches slightly. It's doing it right now. My eye does not twitch when I lie. It absolutely does. You just did it again when you denied it. Ava touched her left eye self-consciously. This conversation is over. One real date. Not coincidental coffee shop encounters, an actual dinner where we're both honest about the fact that we're interested in each other and we're exploring whether that interest could develop into something meaningful. If it doesn't work, I'll stop the courtship and we'll maintain purely professional relationship through Min-jun's education. But give me one actual chance. If I agree to one date, will you stop ambushing me at coffee shops? I'll stop ambushing you at coffee shops. Though I reserve the right to continue engaging you in substantive conversations when we naturally encounter each other. Fine. One date. But this doesn't change anything about Min-jun's discipline. I'm still going to hold him to the same standards regardless of whether we're dating. I wouldn't expect anything else. Their first official date was at a high-end restaurant in downtown Chicago. The kind of place Eunseok normally took business associates rather than romantic interests, chosen specifically because Ava had mentioned she'd never been to restaurants like this and was curious what they were actually like. This is excessive, Ava said, looking at the menu where entrees started at $80. We could have gone somewhere more moderate. I wanted to take you somewhere special. Somewhere that demonstrates I'm taking this seriously. Taking me to an expensive restaurant doesn't demonstrate you're serious. It demonstrates you have money. Those aren't the same thing. Fair point. What would demonstrate I'm serious? Actually listening when I talk about my work. Asking meaningful questions about my life and my goals. Showing genuine interest in who I am rather than just trying to impress me with wealth and influence. I can do that. Tell me about your work. What made you want to become a teacher? Ava told him about growing up in poverty on Chicago's South Side, about teachers who'd seen potential in her that her circumstances suggested shouldn't exist, about how education had been her path to college and graduate school and eventually to a career where she could provide the same opportunities for other children from difficult backgrounds. I teach at Riverside because private schools pay better than public schools and I'm still paying off student loans. But my goal is eventually to teach in public schools in underserved neighborhoods. That's where teachers can make the most difference. You could make a difference at Riverside. Wealthy children need good teachers too. They do. But they have access to resources that poor children don't. My skills are more valuable in environments where students don't have extensive support systems outside school. That's admirable. Though it means you'll eventually leave Riverside and I'll lose the excuse of being Min-jun's parent for maintaining contact. You'll find other excuses if you're determined. You've proven you're very persistent. They talked for 3 hours. The conversation ranged from Ava's teaching philosophy to Eunseok's complicated relationship with his criminal profession. He'd inherited the organization from his father, had considered leaving but felt obligation to the people whose livelihoods depended on operations he managed, was actively trying to transition to more legitimate business operations but finding extraction from organized crime substantially more complex than entry had been. Why not just walk away? Ava asked. You're wealthy enough to support yourself and Min-jun without criminal income. Why continue? Because walking away would create succession conflicts that would be violent and destructive. Because hundreds of people depend on the operations I manage for their incomes. Because it's not as simple as just deciding to leave when you're responsible for an entire organizational structure. Those sound like rationalizations for staying comfortable rather than doing difficult ethical work of extraction. They are rationalizations. But they're also genuine concerns about real people who'd be hurt if I handled this irresponsibly. So handle it responsibly. Build legitimate businesses, transfer criminal operations to successors who can manage them, extract yourself systematically rather than all at once. It's complex but it's possible if you actually prioritize it. Why do you care whether I leave organized crime? We barely know each other. Because I don't want to date someone whose profession is fundamentally built on violence and exploitation. And because Min-jun deserves a father whose life doesn't create constant danger and moral corruption. So if we're exploring this relationship seriously, you need to seriously explore transition away from criminal operations. That's a significant demand for a first date. It's an important value for any relationship I'd consider building. I can't be with someone who's actively choosing to stay in organized crime when they have the resources and capability to leave. Eunseok thought about that. How long would you give me to transition? I don't know. How long would it actually take if you prioritized it? 2 to 3 years to do it properly. Transfer operations, build legitimate businesses, extract without creating violent succession conflicts. Then you have 2 to 3 years to prove you're serious about changing. We can continue dating during that time if you're actively working on transition. But I won't commit to anything long-term with someone who's still actively running criminal operations. That's fair. And it gives me concrete motivation beyond just abstract ethical concerns about my profession. I'm not your motivation to become a better person. I'm a person who has standards about who I'll build a life with. You need to want to change for yourself and for Min-jun, not just to date me. I want to change for all of those reasons. But I'll admit that dating you is the most compelling motivation I've had in years to actually do the difficult work instead of just planning for it. After dinner, Eunseok drove Ava home. They sat in his car outside her apartment building, neither quite ready for the date to end. This was good, Ava said finally. Better than I expected given that you threatened me the first time we met. I apologize again for that. I was prepared to be violent based on the assumption that you'd hurt my son. Learning that you were actually teaching him valuable lessons was humbling. How is Min-jun doing? With the structure and consequences? He's struggling. He doesn't like that actions have actual ramifications now. But he's also developing better self-control. Last week he apologized to me for something. I can't remember the last time he apologized for anything before you started teaching him accountability. That's significant progress. It means he's internalizing that his behavior affects other people and that he's responsible for those effects. Thank you for teaching him that. For not giving up on him just because he was difficult initially. That's my job. I don't give up on students because they're challenging. Often the most difficult students are the ones who need structure most. Can I see you again? Another date? Yes. But slowly. I'm not rushing into anything with someone whose life is as complicated as yours. Slow is acceptable. I'll take whatever pace you're comfortable with. He walked her to her apartment door, didn't try to kiss her despite obvious mutual attraction, just said goodnight and left. Ava went inside processing the fact that she'd just had an excellent first date with a crime boss who'd threatened her a month ago and who was now apparently planning to transition to legitimate business operations partially because she'd told him that was a requirement for serious relationship. It was surreal. But it was also genuine in ways that made her hopeful they might actually be able to build something meaningful despite the terrible circumstances of their initial meeting. Eunseok's transition away from organized crime took 18 months instead of the 2 to 3 years he'd initially estimated. He was motivated. Both by his relationship with Ava, which was developing into something serious and sustainable, and by recognition that Min-jun deserved a father whose profession didn't create constant danger and moral corruption. The transition was complex, expensive, and required navigating dangerous politics within his organization and with rival groups who saw his departure as potential opportunity. But he did it. Systematically transferred criminal operations to trusted successors, built legitimate businesses in real estate development and import-export operations, extracted himself from the violent aspects of organized crime that had defined his life for 15 years. Ava supported him throughout. Not by being involved in the operations, she maintained complete separation from that world, but by being present for him emotionally as he worked through the difficult process of leaving. How was it today, she'd ask after particularly challenging meetings with rival organizations. Frustrating. The Colombians think my transition is weakness they can exploit. I had to convince them that leaving organized crime doesn't mean I've lost my capability for violence if they push too hard. Did you have to actually be violent? No. Just credibly threatening. They backed down once they understood I'm still capable of defending myself and my interests even if I'm no longer actively pursuing criminal operations. I'm proud of you for doing this difficult work instead of just staying comfortable in the profession you inherited. I'm doing it for you. For Min-jun. For myself. All three motivations are important. Meanwhile, Min-jun was thriving under Ava's continued teaching. He'd stopped expecting special treatment, had learned to accept consequences for poor behavior, was developing the kind of character and discipline that would serve him well beyond just elementary school. He's a different child than he was a year ago, Eunseok told Ava one evening. They were at her apartment. Eunseok had essentially moved in over the past 6 months, though he maintained his own residence for appearances. You've transformed how he thinks about authority and responsibility. He's a good kid who needed structure. I just provided that structure consistently. You did more than that. You taught him that his family's wealth and influence don't exempt him from basic behavioral expectations. That's a lesson he'll carry his entire life. I hope so. I'd hate to think I worked this hard just to have him revert to entitled behavior once he's no longer in my classroom. He won't revert. I'm reinforcing the same principles at home now. Consistent expectations, real consequences, genuine accountability. It's harder than just indulging him, but the results are worth it. Min-jun had noticed his father's relationship with his teacher, had processed it with the pragmatic adaptability of children. Are you going to marry Miss Foster? He'd asked Eunseok one morning. Would that bother you if I did? No. She's nice. And she makes you happy. You smile more when you're talking to her. I do smile more. She makes me want to be better father, better person, better at managing my life responsibly. Are you going to ask her? Eventually. When the timing is right and when I've completed my transition to legitimate operations. She deserves someone whose life is stable rather than someone still extracting himself from organized crime. But the timing came sooner than Eunseok had planned. It came during a school event, Riverside's annual spring festival, where families celebrated student achievements and teachers were recognized for excellent work. Ava had been nominated for Riverside's Teacher of the Year award based on her students' academic progress and the transformative impact she'd had on challenging students like Min-jun. Eunseok attended with Min-jun, watched Ava receive the award, listened to her give a speech about the importance of holding all students to high standards regardless of family background. Some of my students come from families with significant resources, she said during her speech. Those resources are valuable. But they're not substitutes for character, discipline, and genuine effort. My job is teaching students that who they become is more important than what they inherit. That their choices matter more than their circumstances. That they're capable of becoming good people if they're willing to do the difficult work that requires. She looked at Min-jun while she said it, and Eunseok saw his son smile with genuine pride in his teacher's recognition. After the ceremony, after the congratulations and the photographs, Eunseok found Ava in her classroom packing up materials. Congratulations on the award. It's well deserved. Thank you. I'm still processing that I won. There are so many excellent teachers at Riverside. You're exceptional. Not just at teaching academic content but at actually transforming how children think about themselves and their responsibilities. That's kind of you to say. It's accurate. You transformed how Min-jun thinks about authority. You transformed how I think about parenting. You transformed my entire approach to life by showing me that some people actually maintain principles regardless of pressure or incentives to compromise. Where are you going with this? I'm going somewhere very specific. Please let me finish before you respond. Eunseok got down on one knee in Ava's empty classroom. The same classroom where he'd burst in 18 months ago planning violence, where she'd refused to be intimidated despite having every reason to fear him. Ava Foster, you are the most extraordinary person I've ever met. You're brilliant, principled, completely unafraid to challenge people who try to intimidate you. You've made me want to be better father, better person, someone worthy of your respect and affection. I've spent the past 18 months transitioning away from organized crime, building legitimate businesses, becoming someone who could actually deserve you. I'm not perfect. I still have complicated history and I'll always have some connection to the world I came from. But I'm completely committed to building a legitimate life that matches your values and that gives Min-jun a father he can be proud of rather than just afraid of. He pulled out a ring. Simple but elegant, chosen specifically because Ava had mentioned she didn't like ostentatious displays of wealth. Will you marry me? Will you take a chance on someone who started as a threat in your classroom and who's become someone who can't imagine living without you? Ava stared at him, processing the fact that the man who'd threatened her for disciplining his son was now proposing marriage in the same classroom where that threat had occurred. This is insane. We've known each other 18 months. You threatened to kill me when we first met. Now you're proposing? I know it's fast. I know the circumstances were terrible. But I also know that you're the person I want to spend my life with, that you've transformed everything about how I approach the world, that I'm better with you than I've ever been alone. What about Min-jun? How does he feel about this? He's excited. He loves you. He wants you to be his stepmother officially rather than just his teacher who's dating his dad. And your transition? Are you completely out of organized crime? Completely. I'm running legitimate businesses now. Real estate development, import-export operations, consulting work for companies navigating international regulations. All legal, all sustainable, all building something I can be proud of rather than just something that generates money through violence and exploitation. You did that. Actually completed the transition. I did it because you showed me it was possible, because you wouldn't accept me staying in organized crime as a long-term partner, and because I wanted to be someone who could deserve you. Ava looked at the ring, at Eunseok kneeling in her classroom, at the sincerity in his expression. Yes. I'll marry you. But I have conditions. Name them. We're partners. Equal partners. Not you making decisions and me going along with them because you're wealthy and influential. We make major decisions together. Agreed absolutely. Min-jun comes first. Always. If there's ever a conflict between what I want and what he needs, he wins. He's been through enough disruption losing his mother. I won't be a stepmother who prioritizes my relationship with you over his well-being. I wouldn't want you to be. That's one of the things I love about you, you genuinely care about my son's development rather than just seeing him as obstacle to dating me. And you continue building legitimate life. No backsliding into criminal operations when legitimate business gets difficult or frustrating. I'm done with that world. Permanently. You have my word. Then yes. I'll marry you. Despite the absolutely insane way we met and the completely inappropriate circumstances that brought us together. Eunseok stood, put the ring on her finger, kissed her for the first time in the classroom where their entire relationship had started with him planning violence and her refusing to be intimidated. Min-jun burst into the classroom, he'd apparently been waiting in the hallway listening to the proposal. She said yes. Does that mean Ms. Foster is going to be my mom now? Stepmom, Ava corrected gently. Your mom was someone very special who loved you very much. I'm not replacing her. But I'll be your stepmom and I'll love you and take care of you. Can I still call you Ms. Foster at school? You have to call me Ms. Foster at school. I'm still your teacher for the rest of the year. But at home you can call me Ava or whatever you're comfortable with. This is the best day ever, Min-jun announced. Eunseok looked at Ava holding his son's hand, both of them smiling, and thought about how 18 months ago he'd been planning to harm this woman for daring to discipline his child. Now she was going to be his wife. The person who'd transformed not just how he parented but how he approached everything about his life. They married 6 months later in a ceremony that combined Korean and American traditions, attended by Ava's family and friends and Eunseok's legitimate business associates. His former criminal connections were notably absent, a deliberate choice that reinforced his transition. Ava's mother pulled her aside before the ceremony. Are you sure about this? He was a crime boss. That history doesn't just disappear. He was a crime boss. Past tense. He's been completely legitimate for the past 2 years. He's transformed his life, Mom. For me, for Min-jun, for himself. I believe people can change if they're genuinely committed to it. I hope you're right. Because you're betting your life on that belief. I am. And I think it's a good bet. The ceremony was beautiful. Min-jun served as ring bearer, took his role very seriously, beamed with pride when Eunseok and Ava exchanged vows. I promise to continue being the person you've inspired me to become, Eunseok said during his vows. To be a good father to Min-jun, a good partner to you, and a good man who builds legitimate success rather than criminal power. You've shown me that integrity is possible even when it's difficult. I promise to honor that lesson every day of our marriage. I promise to challenge you when you need challenging, to support you when you need support, and to be the kind of partner who makes you better while also expecting you to make me better, Ava said during her vows. We've built something meaningful from terrible beginnings. I promise to keep building that with you. 3 years after their wedding, they'd created a life that neither had anticipated when Eunseok had burst into Ava's classroom planning violence. Eunseok ran successful legitimate businesses, had completely severed ties with organized crime, was known in Chicago's business community as a reformed figure who'd successfully transitioned from criminal operations to legitimate success. Ava had left Riverside and was teaching at a public school in an underserved South Side neighborhood. The environment where she'd always believed she could make the most difference. Her students were challenging, came from difficult backgrounds, needed the same kind of structure and high expectations she'd provided to Min-jun. Min-jun was thriving. He was 13 now, in 8th grade, maintaining excellent academics while also developing the character and discipline that would serve him well beyond school. He'd processed his father's past without it defining him, understood that people could change and that his father's transformation was something to be proud of rather than ashamed of. Do you ever regret it? Eunseok asked Ava one evening. They were at home, Min-jun was at a friend's house, and they had rare time alone together. Marrying someone with my history? Never. Though I do occasionally remind myself that our entire relationship started because you threatened me for giving your son detention. I prefer to frame it as I recognized someone exceptional and pursued her despite initial terrible circumstances. You burst into my classroom radiating violent intent. That's the accurate framing. Both things can be true. Why did you really propose? Beyond just being attracted to me or appreciating that I transformed Min-jun's behavior? Because you were the first person I'd met in years who made me want to be better. Not because being better would benefit me strategically, but because you showed me that being better was valuable for its own sake. You had principles you wouldn't compromise. You maintained integrity even when it would have been easier to just give in. That made me realize I could have principles too, that I could maintain integrity, that I didn't have to stay in profession I'd inherited just because extraction was difficult. So I inspired you to leave organized crime. You inspired me to become someone who could deserve you. Leaving organized crime was a necessary part of that transformation. I'm glad you did the work. Not just for me, but for Min-jun and for yourself. You're a better person now than you were when we met. I'm a better person because you refused to accept me as I was. You demanded transformation and you gave me motivation to actually pursue it instead of just planning for it indefinitely. 5 years after the classroom confrontation that had started their relationship, Eunseok and Ava had built a family that proved people could change if they had sufficient motivation and genuine commitment. Do you think we'd have gotten together if circumstances had been different? Ava asked one night. If we'd met through normal channels instead of through me disciplining Min-jun? Probably not. I wouldn't have been in spaces where I'd encounter teachers. You wouldn't have been in spaces where you'd encounter crime bosses. Our worlds didn't naturally overlap. So we needed the terrible beginning to create the connection. We needed you to be brave enough to discipline a powerful man's son despite potential consequences. And we needed me to be capable of recognizing that your bravery was worth more than my pride. Both were necessary. I wasn't brave. I was just doing my job with integrity. You were absolutely brave. Most people would have given Min-jun special treatment to avoid conflict with his dangerous father. You refused despite knowing the risks. That's bravery. They'd proven that the most meaningful relationships sometimes start in the most unlikely circumstances. That someone who threatens you might become someone you build a life with if they're capable of genuine transformation. That love can develop from foundations that should have been disqualifying if both people are willing to change and grow. The teacher who disciplined a mafia boss's son. The boss who arrived planning murder and left planning marriage. Both of them building a family from that explosive beginning, proving that terrible first impressions can transform into meaningful partnerships if both people choose to become better than their initial encounter suggested was possible. 10 years after Eunseok had burst into Ava's classroom, they celebrated their 7th wedding anniversary with Min-jun. Now 18 and heading to college, well-adjusted and thoughtful, with the character and discipline his stepmother had helped develop during those formative years when she'd refused to give him special treatment despite his father's threats. "Thank you," Eunseok told Ava that evening. "For not being intimidated. For refusing to compromise your principles. For transforming my son and transforming me and building this family from what should have been a catastrophic first meeting. Thank you for being capable of change. For doing the difficult work of leaving organized crime. For being a good father and a good partner even though it required transforming everything about your life. I'd do it all again. The transformation, the difficulty, all of it. For you. For Min-jun. For this family we've built. Me too. Though I still think it's insane that we started with you threatening me and ended with marriage and family. Best threat I ever made. Resulted in the best thing in my life. That's a terrible way to frame our relationship. But accurate. They'd proven that fear is a weapon until you meet someone who doesn't understand they're supposed to be afraid, and that person's courage can transform you into someone better than you ever thought you could be. Courage changes people. Not just the person being courageous, but the people who witness that courage and recognize it as something they want to become. Ava Foster disciplined a powerful man's child because she believed all students deserved the same standards regardless of family background. That was professional integrity, not strategic courage. She was just doing her job properly. But it was also extraordinarily brave because she knew the potential consequences and chose principle over safety anyway. Eunseok Shik responded to that courage by recognizing it as something he'd never encountered before. Someone who couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated into compromising their values. That recognition transformed him from someone planning violence into someone wanting to become worthy of the person who'd shown him what genuine integrity looked like. Their story proves that first impressions don't determine final outcomes if people are willing to change. Eunseok arrived planning to harm Ava. He left planning to transform his entire life to become someone who could deserve her respect and affection. That transformation required genuine work, 18 months of extracting himself from organized crime, building legitimate businesses, fundamentally changing how he approached power and responsibility. It wasn't performative change to manipulate Ava into dating him. It was real transformation motivated by recognizing that she represented values worth pursuing. Ava's contribution was maintaining her standards without wavering. She didn't give Eunseok special treatment because he was powerful or because she was attracted to him. She held him accountable the same way she held her students accountable, with clear expectations and genuine consequences for not meeting them. That consistency is what made transformation possible. If she'd compromised her principles to make the relationship easier, she'd have reinforced that everything was negotiable and that integrity was performative rather than real. Their story also proves that relationships built on challenging beginnings can be stronger than relationships with easy starts. They didn't ignore or minimize how they met. They acknowledged it was terrible and they used it as motivation to build something better than those circumstances suggested was possible. Most importantly, they demonstrated that courage is contagious. Ava's courage to discipline a dangerous man's child despite threats inspired Eunseok's courage to leave his inherited profession despite it being the easier path. Both acts of courage fed each other, creating a relationship built on mutual willingness to do difficult things because they mattered. The teacher who refused to be intimidated. The crime boss who recognized that refusal as something worth transforming himself to deserve. Both of them proving that the person who threatens you might become the person you build your life with if they're capable of genuine change and if you're brave enough to demand that change rather than accepting them as they are. If you love this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about courage-inspiring transformation, terrible beginnings becoming meaningful partnerships, and people who become better because someone refused to accept them being anything less. Comment below, Would you discipline a powerful person's child knowing the potential consequences? Or would self-preservation override professional integrity? Share your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and remember, your courage to maintain your principles despite pressure might inspire someone else to transform their entire life. Don't compromise your integrity because intimidation is easier to manage than conflict. Sometimes conflict creates the conditions for meaningful change. Until next time.